Good morning, this is Dan Weaver, your host of Valley Vox, and I have a couple guests with me today. But before we get to them, we're going to be talking, by the way, about the Mohawk Valley during the American Revolution. But before we get to our guest, I would like to make a few announcements. One, if you tuned in last week and you didn't hear the show, it was because the transmitter was out. I don't know what Tim did to it, but just kidding, Tim. Anyway, the transmitter was out last week, so there was no show. Today, 10 to 4, there's going to be an antique show at the Arkell Museum in Canajoharie to benefit the historic Nellis Tavern, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. It's $4 admission, $8 if you want to go to the antique show and to the museum. And if you want to have some items appraised, you can bring in 2 items and have them appraised for $5. There's going to be 25 dealers there. Of course, remember tomorrow morning or late tonight before you go to bed to turn your clocks ahead by 1 hour. Also tomorrow, the last local auditions for cast and crew for the film The Last Frankenstein will be held in the Fenimore Gallery at Proctor's Theater on State Street in Schenectady. They had a pretty good turnout here in Amsterdam last week. So this should be your last chance tomorrow at noon. I think it's noon to 5 at the Fenimore Gallery, Proctor's Theater on State Street in Schenectady. Much of that film will be filmed in Amsterdam. Next week, our show, 50 Shades of Green. We'll be talking about the Irish because St. Paddy's Day is coming up. Rob Van Hasselen, city historian, will be here to talk about the Irish in Amsterdam and the Irish in the Mohawk Valley. That will be half the show. The other half of the show, Rob will be talking about economic and community development in Amsterdam. And our contest, we still don't have a winner. I asked what actor met his wife in Amsterdam. I gave you some clues. I said that he was honored by the city of Amsterdam at a celebration at the Antlers Club in 1950. I'm going to give you 2 new clues today. He won an Oscar in 1943, and he ran Union College summer theater program for several years, back in the 1940s, I believe. So, do a little Googling, maybe you'll find the answer. If you have the answer, you can leave it on my cell phone, 842-7504. Between now and 12:15, leave it on my cell phone, or you can email it to me at danieltweaver@gmail.com. danieltweaver@gmail.com if you think you have the answer. And if the first person to come up with the answer will win a copy of my book, The Virgin and the Strip Mall and Other Essays on Amsterdam, the Mohawk Valley, and Upstate New York. And finally, before I introduce my guest, you might have noticed in the Amsterdam Recorder today, which is the paper that sponsored this station, you may have noticed a new column, and coincidentally, the person writing the column has the same name as mine. So you might want to look at that in today's Recorder. Now I want to introduce our guests from the Fort Plain Museum, Norm Bollen, who is the president of the Fort Plain Museum, and Brian Mack, who is the treasurer of the Fort Plain Museum. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, Dan.
Good morning, Dan. Thank you for having us.
We're going to talk about the Mohawk Valley during the American Revolution. I just purchased a book called Montgomery County Geography, but the funny thing was, it wasn't just about Montgomery County geography, it was about Montgomery County history. And it came out in about 1910 in there, and it was maybe 60, 70 pages of material that they wanted school children to learn. And I was amazed at how much material was in there, and I know that most adults I meet today don't know most of that material, especially not just the geography part, but the history part. So I think it's important to have people on here to talk about the Mohawk Valley, its role in the American Revolution. And in your flyer that you're passing out, and we'll get to that in a minute about this conference you're having, it states, the Mohawk Valley played a key role in the struggle for American independence. What was the role? What role did the Mohawk Valley play, and why was it a key role in the American independence?
Well, it was important because at the moment of the founding of the nation, our Congress, the first Continental Congress, they were concerned about where the borders were going to be of the country. They knew that they wanted to make the western border the Mississippi River, the northern border, although there was plans of trying to bring Canada into the whole plan, but they pretty much figured the northern border was going to be along the St. Lawrence. But the only way to get into the interior of America was the Mohawk River Valley. That was the break in the Appalachian Mountains. So it was the key water route. And there was a lot of discussion that if they could not find a easy communication route to the interior of America, they'd never be able to hold the country together. So from day one, they knew it was important that they secured that route through the Mohawk Valley out to the Great Lakes for the future.
Okay, and that's something we forget today. We forget that how important the Mohawk Valley is, because now we can whip over the Appalachian Mountains at 75 miles an hour on all these interstates.
That's right. That's right.
And so it's meaningless to us today, but in those days,
and that's the difference. It's like comparing some little windy dirt road to a super highway.
Right.
Here it was everybody moved by water, and that was the only near sea level. That it does gradually go up, but it was the only route that you could take by water to the interior of America.
And when you get out there where the noses are, it's a really tight squeeze.
And that's the break right there.
Sure.
In the Appalachian chain.
And actually, it was probably tighter. They must have done some dynamiting out there in order to put the railroad in the roads.
I've read some journals that talk about where you go the road goes around from Yost, where you go around Big Nose. That at that time it was just a narrow path that you could only go through around single file.
Sure.
It's actually why when you get these paths of invasion with the armies later on, the armies were on the south side of the river, and they'd wait till they passed the noses before they crossed to the north side of the river, because they couldn't get around that big nose.
Well, what is your sense about local residents? Do they understand? Do most of them understand what happened during the Revolution, or the importance of it? Do you have any sense of that?
I think it depends on where your interests lie. You always hear about the people who live in New York City that have never been to the Statue of Liberty, and they haven't been to the Empire State Building, and it's like that around here. You take a lot of this history for granted. Hopefully, if you caught some exposure to it in school, like I did when I went to school, we had local history units that they covered, and I was lucky enough that I grew up right down the street from the Fort Plain Museum, so we were tied into it from an early age. So if you get that kind of exposure to it, later in life you're gonna be into it a little bit more. But I think that's going to be one of our goals too, is to try to raise the profile and let people know how important that history is and what it can do for us.
Right. Do you see an interest in the Mohawk Valley from non-residents?
Oh yes, we get that a lot. Heritage tourism is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and that was part of what the whole Path Through History project was about. And we worked a lot on the Path Through History project that Governor Cuomo had started, but going, let's see. I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
That's okay. That's okay.
We're talking about Path Through History. Well, let me talk about Path Through History for a second.
Sure.
Path Through History was an effort to introduce people across the country to New York's history, and in our case, with the Mohawk Valley, we decided to focus on the American Revolution, because those were key stories. So a lot was done with forming a committee and working on developing these stories. There's a brochure that came out. There's a website and so on to encourage heritage tourism in the Mohawk Valley, and it did a lot for us. It really did generate a lot of new visitors coming through the valley. Now, to answer your question earlier, I had found, I went down to Colonial Williamsburg last year for a conference, and the man that put the conference on, his name was Bruce Ventnor. He's done bus trips to the Mohawk Valley brought people through. He lives down in Virginia, and he was running the conference at Colonial Williamsburg, and he was nice enough to introduce me to the room, about 75 people or so, and I can't tell you how many people came up to me and said, we've always heard about all this great colonial history in the Mohawk Valley, and we just have never had a reason to go up there.
Right.
So we decided maybe we better start making reasons for them to come up here.
Well, what about professional historians? Are they, I know there's been books written about the Mohawk Valley, but do they see the campaigns, the Mohawk Valley battle area as being an important part of the Revolution, or do they give it enough attention, do you think?
That's a tough one. Some of the older books you look through, there is certainly, especially the local history books, there's a lot of interesting material, but it doesn't seem to really tie all together as good as it should to really explain the story of what was going on. And I think that's created a little bit of confusion. Also, when you get into the story of just Fort Plain itself, Fort Plain was also known as Fort Rensselaer.
I see.
And we often see in these earlier history books, a lot of these guys were confused by it, and so they just kind of skipped over it. They just gloss over it. If you don't know the details, you skip over it.
Well, let me ask Brian a question, then I'll ask you also. If you had to pick one book, Brian, on the Mohawk Valley and the Revolution, is there one book out there? Is there a book out there that you can recommend for people to get a general overview?
Some of the older books out there by Sims and stuff are good general overviews of the valley, but as far as newer books, Gavin Watt put out a couple books. One was Rebellion in the Mohawk, about the 77 campaign. Then he also did one, Burning of the Valleys, which was about 1780. And that does a good deal of explaining kind of what happened, but really, as far as one book, I guess maybe it hasn't been written yet.
Okay. What about you, Norm?
Yeah, and those books that he mentioned, those are very detailed books, and I think it depends on the reader and what they're looking for. If you wanted just a good general overview, if you look at what Richard Burles' book called Bloody Mohawk,
right?
I saw that everywhere in bookstores for a while, and he covers the French and Indian War as well as the Revolution. He's a good writer, so it's a good general narrative. I haven't read the whole thing because it's not detailed enough, and frankly, I get bored with it. But when you get into the real detailed stuff, as Brian just mentioned, Gavin Watt's first two books have some real nice detail in them. And also, there's an older one from the 70s called, The Iroquois and the American Revolution by Barbara Graymont. That was written, I think, around 1975. And she goes into a lot of real well-documented detail about not only the Iroquois Indians, but the whole Revolutionary War struggle up and down the valley. So that's always a good one.
Well, I was born in Delaware County, but we moved to Maine when I was 8. So then I came back here when I came to the Mohawk Valley when I was around 21. But my introduction to the Mohawk Valley, strangely enough, was in Maine when I stumbled upon Drums Along the Mohawk, which is fiction, historical fiction.
Right.
But I got to tell you, that's when I fell in love with the Mohawk Valley. Then I went on to read some of his other books, Erie, Water, Rome Hall, and so on. And I have to tell you, that was the start of it. And when I came here, I wanted to see the places he talked about and so on. So I don't know if either of you have read that. And if you have, is the history in it any good, or is it?
I don't. The history's not too bad. Historical. There's a place for historical fiction. A lot of us diehards don't read it because we want to make sure everything we're reading is true. But when you look that book over, he definitely bases it on good historical fact. In fact, one of the other programs that we're working on, our Mohawk Country program, which is going to be an association that we formed of about 8 historic sites in western Montgomery County, and we're going to do some events during July, and one of those events was going to be at the beginning of Drums Along the Mohawk. That book opens where they talk about Gil and Lana getting married at the Palatine Church by the Reverend Gross. Well, there was a Reverend Gross, and of course the Palatine Church is still there.
Right.
And so we're actually going to do a reenactment with there's a group called the Drums Along the Mohawk Players.
Sure, I've heard of them.
They reenact the whole book. Where is that done? That's done out at Gelston Castle.
Yeah, Gelston Castle.
They do that in August, but they're going to come
by
down.
Herkimer.
They're going to come down our way at the end of July, and they're going to stage the wedding at the Palatine Church, and we're going to do a reception with all the actors still in character
Right.
at the Nellis Tavern. So
that
that'll be
sounds
kind of a
great.
cool thing, I think.
Yeah, one thing I know the book Drums Along the Mohawk covered quite well was the Battle of Oriskany, and that was my first introduction to that battle. But anyway, let's talk about the museum a little bit, because I think for a long time I was confused about your museum. It's called the Fort Plain Museum, but the village of Fort Plain, you get the village of Fort Plain, you
Right.
get the Fort Plain Museum. So I didn't know whether the museum was all about the village of Fort Plain's history, or if it was just about the fort itself that was
It
located.
started out, the museum started out in 1961 kind of as a for-profit venture. I think the people that organized it back then envisioned something along the lines of what Fort William Henry had become. In fact, the man that started the Fort Plain Museum had been a director, a manager up at Fort William Henry. So it kind of started that way. They started out with archaeological digs on the Fort Hill and identified the site of the blockhouse and several other sites that they weren't quite sure what they were.
Right.
And so archaeology was done, and the materials that were found went into exhibits down in the museum. And then over the years, these little organizations tend to be volunteer-run, and volunteers, all well-meaning people, but they start thinking about other periods of history. Fort Plain was a big Erie Canal town, so
Yes.
we developed Erie Canal exhibits, and so you get into these other time periods. So the original message and mission to talk about Revolutionary War Fort Plain, that kind of got lost
I see.
along the way. So we've brought that back. The last 8 or 10 years, we've been working on bringing that back now, and that's been our primary mission. Although we still have these other time periods up there, but.
Okay, I just wondered about that because I was never sure, and to be honest with you, it's not to my credit. It's kind of shameful that it took me until last year to get out to your museum. Somebody said in a meeting I was at the other week that in Montgomery County there's this wall or division that's Route 30A. It cuts off the western part of the county from the eastern part, and a lot of us who live here in the eastern part of the county, especially in the city of Amsterdam, we totally forget that there's another part of the county. And
It's a long county. I always think of the Noses as being the big break.
well, that's a good place to make a break too. So, what year was the actual fort built?
The fort, some of the early history books, they said that they had guessed that it was built by Elias Dayton from the 3rd New Jersey Regiment in 1776. We've since learned from all the archival research that we've done that it really was built during the winter of 1778 and 79 in response to the Cherry Valley Massacre.
Okay.
All during 1778, you start having, just to back up for a second,
Sure.
the Battle of Oriskany is 77, in August of 77. After that Battle of Oriskany, half of the Tryon militia has been wiped out, so the valley is really defenseless. So then all during 78, you get all the raids occurring around the perimeter of the valley. Cobleskill is attacked, Ephrata is burned, German Flats is burned, Springfield, a place called Andrestown out near Jordanville is burned. And then the last big raid at the end of the year in November was the Cherry Valley Massacre.
Okay.
The response to that Cherry Valley Massacre, with refugees coming into the valley for safety, and those locals right there around Fort Plain realizing the war was going to get to them, they decided they had to erect a stockade for safety, and it was done on the Leib farm up on the hilltop there. Soldiers from the 4th New York Regiment were involved in the construction of just a basic stockade, place of refuge, no buildings in it.
Okay. But it was more than what a fortified homestead would be? or?
Right, it was. You do have, if you take like a place like Fort Plank, for example, Fort Plank, you always get some confusion about Fort Plank and Fort Plain. Now, Fort Plank was out on Paris Road, about 2 miles west of Fort Plain, Paris Road being off of Route 5S. And Paris Road follows along a high ridge that has a clear view of Cherry Valley. So you had a property owner up there named, I think it was Frederick Plank, I think was the name, but so they basically fortified his home. They erected a stockade around his home. They put up a blockhouse, and that becomes kind of a lookout position where they could keep an eye to the south and west, because that's where all the raids were coming from. Joseph Brant was raiding out of Unadilla, his base in Unadilla and Anaquagas. So he was raiding up that way. So they'd watch the horizon for smoke, basically. And so that was the fortified home there. In the case with Fort Plain, a bunch of residents got together and went up to the highest point overlooking the river and erected a separate stockade.
Okay, so we had Fort Hunter closer to Amsterdam.
Right.
Then you had a fort out in Rome, right?
Right. Fort Stanwix.
Stanwix.
Yeah.
Fort Stanwix.
Okay, so
and there was one in the Utica area called Fort Schuyler too.
Okay. So would Fort Plain have been the only thing in between, say, the Amsterdam area and the Rome area, besides the fortified homestead?
It doesn't start out that way. You know,
Okay.
what happens is, a lot of this stuff, because people were just fortifying their homes,
Sure.
it's kind of haphazard.
Right.
Yeah.
But then as they're getting more organized, as far as the Army goes, they're getting more organized, and there's a need to set up a supply chain from the Albany-Schenectady area to Fort Stanwix, which Fort Stanwix gets rebuilt by the Americans, and they rename it Fort Schuyler.
Okay.
So it gets confusing, because now you got two Fort Schuylers.
Yes.
You got old Fort Schuyler and new Fort Schuyler. So those things start drive you crazy when you're doing research. But so now they need the supply chain. So there are letters that talk about they were using Fort Plank at the beginning, but it was off the river, a good couple miles off the river. So they actually talk about Fort Plank being kind of out of the public way. It's a pain to get to.
Yeah.
So then we find records that talk where they actually moved the entire storage of the fort. Their stores are moved to Fort Plain, and they begin rebuilding Fort Plain into a stronger outpost.
Okay.
That really starts to take shape after what's called the Canajoharie Raid of August 2nd, and that's one of the things we often celebrate at the museum. After the August 2nd raid, that's when General Van Rensselaer comes up and they start rebuilding the fort. They rename the Fort Rensselaer and begin using it as his base of operations.
Okay, I just want to remind our listeners, if you came in late, that we're talking today to Norm Bollen and Brian Mack of the Fort Plain Museum. And Brian, feel free to jump in anytime to answer any of these questions. And actually, you've answered some of the questions I was going to ask you. But who was in charge? Was there a general, a colonel, or somebody in charge of the fort? Actually?
Well, again, all of these, when you're examining this history, it's all a snapshot in time.
Sure.
Robert Van Rensselaer was promoted to general, I think it was like June of 1780. He's promoted to general. He's barely in the job, and that's when that August 2nd raid occurs on Fort Plain. So, but he had been in charge of the militias at that time, the Tryon County Militia.
Right.
He had been made general of, but then because of some missteps there, because after the August 2nd raid, then you have, when you get into October, that's when you have the Battle of Stone Arabia,
Yes.
Battle of Clark's Field, and a lot of people are very angry that they didn't think Van Rensselaer handled that too well, especially a guy named John Harper, who actually, from my research, it looks like he wanted the job as general, and I think he was a little irritated he didn't get it. So he was very critical, and he called for a court-martial of General Van Rensselaer, which happened, and you can read the testimony over. And in that testimony, he specifically starts calling Fort Plain, he'll call it Fort Plain or Rensselaer. He uses two names for the fort because he wants it on the record that they do not want to call the fort Fort Rensselaer anymore. They don't like him, and they want him out of there. After that whole series, the series of fiascos and some of the problems, and there were good things that happened. There were victories there too, but that animosity between these officers, Van Rensselaer didn't come back up the valley the following year. General Washington talked Marinus Willett into coming up and taking over operations in the Mohawk Valley, and Willett again made Fort Plain, or Fort Rensselaer, made that his headquarters.
I see.
And so now 1781, it's Willett that's in charge instead of Van Rensselaer.
Well, if for those of you who live on the south side of Amsterdam, I don't know if you've ever stopped and read that plaque next to the South Chuctanunda Creek, but you ought to, because you'll learn a little something about General Van Rensselaer there. In fact, he camped there with, I forget, 500 to 1,000 men until the moon. It says something about until the moon came up over Yankee Hill, and then they marched over Yankee Hill. And
You know, I haven't seen that. I'd like to take
Yes.
a look at it, but that must
Right on
be
Florida Avenue.
1780. That
Right
must-
next to the
that-
bridge.
yes, right next to the bridge on
Do you
Florida
know the
Avenue.
date on that monument?
I can't remember.
I'll bet you it's August of 1780, because see, Van Rensselaer they got word that that the valley was being attacked, and he had to force march an
Yes.
army out of Schenectady late at night. It was like at midnight they left Schenectady and coming up through, so they could very well have stopped there till they had moonrise, so
Yeah.
they could see what they were doing.
Yeah, they went over Yankee Hill, which is where I live, and they must have, I think there's a ford there somewhere, because it was on the way to the Battle of Clocks
And
Field, I
actually-
believe. Yes, they were on
And
the way to
actually, when I
that.
think about that, I told you wrong. It wouldn't be August of 1788. That would have been the battles that followed in October.
Okay.
In October, when you had the Battle of Stone Arabia, because that's Johnson. That's Johnson's army coming up the Schoharie and then turning west in along the Mohawk River. Word was received in Schenectady, he was there, so they had to organize men and go after him. Now, Johnson's men were all skilled, seasoned rangers.
Right.
It was actually the beginning of even what became the American Ranger Corps and the Canadian Ranger Corps. All started with these rangers, and those guys could move fast over the terrain. So for Van Rensselaer to get his men together in Schenectady, who were all volunteers, farmers and shopkeepers, and try to catch him, they just couldn't catch up to him,
Right.
even though they did a forced all-night march.
Sure.
So,
Well,
but I
Brian,
think we're
let's
camping.
get you in here.
Well, Norm's doing a great job.
No, he is, but I want to ask, and I know you've done a lot of stuff on Facebook about this, so I'm going to ask you to, the museum is doing something for the first time this year. You're having a conference, and would you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, it's going to be the first annual conference of the American Revolution in the Mohawk Valley. Norm mentioned earlier how he went down to Williamsburg and went to the conference down there, and we got to know the authors between that, Norm doing that, and I was emailing a few of them, trying to get them to come up to do some lecture series, and then we got to know Don Haggist. He came up last September, did a talk on his book, The British Soldiers, and then getting to talk to him, we found out he was doing another book on the last men of the Revolution, which was a book done in like the 1860s. This Reverend Hillebrand went around, he tried to find the last living soldiers of the American Revolution. He found 6 of them, he took their picture, interviewed them.
That must be interesting, seeing photographs of guys that were in the American Revolution.
Yes, and one of the guys was right up in Edinburgh, New York, Saratoga County, was Samuel Downing. He went and interviewed him, took his picture, he's part of the book, and talking with Don and Norm were switching off a few emails. The word Fort Rensselaer was being traded off, so then we realized that Samuel Downing actually served at Fort Rensselaer in 1782. So talking with Don included all that information in his new book that's coming out, which he will be there to talk about it. And we actually, based on that, Norm did some research. He found an actual original photo of Samuel Downing. We purchased it, and it's currently on exhibit in our new Rev War exhibit at the museum.
Okay, we're going to take a little break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about this conference. And we're talking today, this is Valley Vox, Dan Weaver's your host, and we're talking with Norm Bollen and Brian Mack of the Fort Plain Museum.
since 2005, with locations on Route 30 in Amsterdam, Erie Boulevard in Canajoharie, and North Comrie Ave in Johnstown.
I'm Tim Everhart with a look at the weather for the Cranesville Radio Network. Today, intervals of clouds and sunshine, a flurry or snow shower possible towards the evening, a high in the mid-30s. Tonight, flurry or snow shower possible with minimal accumulations, mostly cloudy, low in the lower 20s. Tomorrow, a mixture of clouds and sunshine, pleasant with 15-mile-an-hour winds, a high in the mid-30s. And don't forget tomorrow that daylight savings time begins at 2 a.m. Remember to set your clocks ahead an hour. I'm Tim Everhart, and that was a look at the weather for the Cranesville Radio Network.
This weather report brought to you by Patriot Federal Bank, proudly serving Fulton and Montgomery County since 2005, with locations on Route 30 in Amsterdam, Erie Boulevard in Canajoharie, and North Comrie Ave in Johnstown. We offer a variety of savings and checking products as well as commercial, residential, and consumer lending. B&B Foundations features estimating, excavating, and foundation work. In business for over 30 years, B&B is fully insured and ready to take on your project. Give them a call at 993-4405. That's 993-4405. B&B Foundations, the only name you need to know for your estimating, excavating, and foundation needs.
Big bands, the roots, the future. Hi, this is Mark Edwards. I'm your host, and I hope you join me for a mix of jazz, show tunes, and of course, big bands. With the big bands sound both old and new. And it's not what you think of when you think of a big band show. You will hear songs from artists like Tony Bennett, Michael Bublé, Lady Gaga, Marilyn Monroe, and more. Big bands like Glenn Miller and all of the company big bands you've heard in the past, and some currents. That's Saturday at 4 p.m. on WCSS. I hope you join me. Have a very wonderful day.
Come bowl a strike for strays at the Feline Guardian Angels Bowl-a-thon this Saturday, March 7th at Kelly Imperial Lanes from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. Cost is $10 and gets you 2 games and a shoe rental. There will also be 50-50 raffles and an ice cream giveaway. That's this Saturday at Kelly Imperial Lanes from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. We'll see you there. Remember to send in all your community announcements to Cranesville Broadcasting at 1250 Riverfront Center, Amsterdam, New York, 12010.
Look at the big tobacco display behind the counter.
Can you believe drugstores are still selling tobacco products?
I know. I'm here to buy things to keep my family healthy, and right by the register, they're selling things that cause disease. That's crazy.
I hear some drugstores have stopped selling tobacco products.
Yeah, but too many of them still do.
Not what you'd expect from a place that says it cares about your health.
It's time to get tobacco products out of drugstores and pharmacies. Show your support at tobaccofreenys.org.
March is Colon Cancer Awareness Month. Did you know that colon cancer is the second leading cause of overall cancer deaths in the U.S.? That means having your colon checked regularly, starting at age 50 or even sooner if you're at a higher risk. For more information on colon cancer and screenings, contact the Cancer Services Program at 841-3726. That's 841-3726 for the Cancer Services Program and information on colon cancer screenings.
Are you thinking about adding a new concrete sidewalk, driveway, or patio? Cranesville Block is here to serve you. We're ready to deliver fresh, affordable concrete at your convenience. To order, give us a call at 518-684-6400 to set up a delivery. Buy local. Choose Cranesville.
This is Dan Weaver, back with Valley Vox on WCSS 1490 AM. And we're talking to Norm Bollen and Brian Mack of the Fort Plain Museum, and we started talking about their first annual conference on the American Revolution. Brian, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what you're going to be doing, what days it is, and what you're going to be doing during these days.
Okay, yes, on Friday, May 1st, starting about 4 p.m., we'll open up registration, sort of like an early registration type thing. People can come up to the museum, register, they can look around, hang out, whatever. But then about 5:30, 6 o'clock, we're going to start a reception. Norm over here will be giving a talk on Fort Plain, the history of Fort Plain, the history of the museum. So that'll probably be about a half-hour talk. The authors will be there. People will be able to meet with the authors.
You have 6 different authors, correct?
Yes, 6 different authors. On May 2nd at 9 a.m., we're going to hold it at the Arkell Museum Hall. We're going to have 6 authors there. I'll just go over them here quickly. Todd Bracey is from New Jersey. His title is A Hellish Plan to Go Over to the Enemy. It's about Lieutenant Edward McMichael. He was with the 3rd New Jersey Regiment. He was stationed at Fort Stanwix out in Rome, and he actually, I think he was out on a scouting mission, and he actually just ran off and joined the British. So Todd will give a good talk on that. We mentioned earlier about Don Haggis. He's going to be going over his new book, The Revolution's Last Men. Samuel Downing, he'll be talking about him, as well as the others. Jack Kelly, he's from the Hudson Valley area. He did a book called The Band of Giants. It's sort of like an overview of the war. He gets into some of the lesser-known people of the war and stuff like that. He said he could kind of tie it into the Mohawk Valley a little bit, but, it'll be just an overview. James Kirby Martin, Forgotten Allies and the Oneida Indians and the American Revolution. That's also another good book. You're asking about books about the Mohawk Valley. This is a good book. It talks about the Oneidas and their roles in the Revolution. So Jim's actually coming up from Houston. He'll be joining us to talk about that book. Bruce Venter, who Norm mentioned earlier, does the bus trips. He has a book coming out on the Battle of Hubbardton, but he wants to talk about the Colonel John Brown, who actually was killed in the Battle of Stone Arabia, but he's going to talk about him in the Battle of Diamond Island on Lake George. And then our last author is Glenn Williams. He did The Year of the Hangman. People usually associate that with 1777, but really it's about 1779 and the Sullivan-Clinton campaign that went through western New York for retaliation of those 78 raids and stuff that Norm mentioned earlier. So those are the 6 authors we're having. And then on Sunday, May 3rd at 9 a.m., starting at the Fort Plain Museum, we're going to have a bus tour of Mohawk Country. Mohawk Country, Noel will talk about in a little bit here, but it's really the western Montgomery County sites off of Exit 29. So we're going to take tour goers we're going to have a bus. We're going to stop to all these sites. Some sites will get out, like Nellis Tavern, Van Alstyne Homestead, 4 o'clock. You can actually tour the buildings, but some will just be maybe a stop, and Norm will provide a good history of that area. And so that'll be on Sunday.
Okay, and what does it cost for people to attend this conference?
Yes, the cost for the 6 authors on Saturday, that's a $40 charge. Pre-registration is required. People can call me at 518-774-5669, or you can email fortplainmuseum@yahoo.com, and I'll provide you with all the necessary information, registration forms. The $40 will include the Friday night reception, the all-day 6-author talk, which will include a boxed lunch. And so that's going to be included in the $40, and then the Sunday bus tour will be a separate $20 fee.
I see.
Additional.
So it sounds to me you get a lot for your money.
Yeah, really. Like Norm was talking about the Williamsburg one, they charge in the hundreds of dollars.
Sure.
Yeah, I think
for
that's
something.
$225.
Yeah,
I think for that they're going to charge us this year because we're heading down there next week for that. But yeah, this is a deal. And we have an application in for a tourism grant actually to help underwrite some of the costs, and we are talking to some other sponsors as well.
Well, what amount of interest have you generated so far? How many people have signed up? Do you know?
I say we're up to 30 people signed up for the conference and bus trip, for both.
And we're still 2 months out, and we haven't even started our heavy advertising yet. So we really expect we're going to fill it right up.
We're getting
here.
good feedback. We got some people from Virginia, Canada, Florida signed up for it that are coming up. And
yeah, one of our goals with this was to encourage people from out of the area, out of state, to come to our area, and we are getting that. And we've got hotel rooms reserved over in Johnstown. We've been in touch with a lot of the B&Bs in Montgomery County, and we're putting some of the authors up at, and
some of the B&Bs are in historic buildings themselves. They're fairly, older, put it that way. I know that the one out near the town of Glen there, I think that's a late 1700s, very early 1800s.
Yeah, I think so. Is that the Brown House?
Well, there's the Brown House, but then there's Halcyon Farm.
Oh, yes,
yeah. Which is very old, very old place. So all this brings us to the subject of historic or heritage tourism. I mean, it seems to me that all the years I've lived in this area, I've been here since 1978, and I've seen a lot of money spent on enticing industry to come here with very mixed results. And as a matter of fact, after all these years I've been here and all the money that's been spent, we seem to have the same rate of, we have the same population, we have the same number of jobs, fewer jobs actually. Nothing has really changed much, and I often wonder, maybe we ought to focus spending our money on heritage tourism, on what is a strength here in Montgomery County. Maybe first you ought to explain what heritage tourism is.
Well, heritage tourism, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. There's a lot of statistics that show when people go on vacation, one of the first things they do is they want to look for an historic site, and so I think there's varying degrees of it. There are casual tourists that want to hit some of the major places. You know, Saratoga Battlefield over here, or they call it Saratoga National Historical Park. They have 150,000 visitors a year coming there.
That's incredible.
And I know the Fort Stanwix National Park out in Rome, at their place, they were seeing, I think it was 75,000 visitors a year, as I recall, and those statistics might be getting a little bit old now, but there's a lot of people that want to hit these mainstream sites, and then you have people that are really deeper into it, that really want to know the backstories, and they want to come to these little places. And I'll tell you, every year, with no advertising, nothing, we see people at the Fort Plain Museum come in from a lot of different states and from a number of foreign countries. We even sometimes have trouble. I remember we had a couple come in from Norway. I think they were Norway or Sweden.
Yeah, Norway.
We've had people come in from Holland often, but it's usually English-speaking countries. I've had people from Australia, from Canada, and from the British Isles. So, we get them all.
Well, I have at least a half a dozen visitors every year to my shop, primarily in the summer from Holland.
Yeah.
They're attracted to this area because of the Dutch names of the
That's
cities,
great.
but not only that, some of their relatives, some of their ancestors came over here, and they're trying to reconnect with them.
as did
So along with his heritage, history, part of heritage is genealogy too, I would think. You've got people coming
Yes.
back looking for their roots.
Yeah, we get a lot of that. People stopping in, a lot of phone calls we get on genealogy too, which is hard to field those kinds of questions on the telephone. We don't have the staff for that, but we're getting better at it.
And there's always the archives in Fonda, which they can go to
and
as
they
well.
do a splendid job.
Yes.
I actually sent a lot of people down there to start there
Right.
if they're looking at area history of their families.
So have you formed any relationships or partnerships with other museums or historical associations?
Well, that's been, I touched on it earlier with the Mohawk Country Program. That's been a recent thing that I started after the Path Through History project, which did a lot of good things. Really, a lot of new signage out, and the website, and their website is getting quite a few hits. So, so that's worked well. And then the program kind of stalled from there. So we were talking about things that we really needed to work more closely together with the historic sites. So what I've done is we've organized a group of 8 historic sites in western Montgomery County, because when you realize that a small area like the Fort Plain, Canterbury, St. Johnsville area, to have 8 different sites,
that's amazing.
7 of them are actually historic sites. One of them is the historic collection at the Margaret Reney Library. But to have all of that, that people could go and visit, somehow we should be working together to promote that.
And now, are these, when you say historic sites, are these sites related to the Revolution or to colonial times and the Revolution?
Yeah, both. Some of them, some of them are going to go. Like the Palatine Church, for example, it was built in 1770, so it's just a few years before the American Revolution.
Right.
It survived because the man that built it, I think that was, I shouldn't talk off the top of my head, it's probably Henry Nellis.
It was a Nellis.
Yeah, he was a loyalist though, and he had gone to Canada, so he made sure that when the army came back down to invade the valley, they did not burn that church down because he had built it. So that church actually survived the Revolution. Whereas you go up to Stone Arabia, those churches were both burned up there, and they were rebuilt immediately after the Revolution. So the Stone Arabia Reformed Church, which is now in a historical society, that was rebuilt in 1788, I think.
Late 80s.
Yeah, I've been by. That's a beautiful church, but it's post-Revolutionary War.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
The building now is.
The building, yes.
Yeah.
So what do you call this group that is Exit 20?
Well, we came up with this was meant to be a marketing association, so we use the name Mohawk Country for marketing. We are talking about plans to expand it, but you have to walk before you can run. So, so we're starting by focusing. See, what we found with the Path Through History project, we had printed up 20 or 25,000 brochures were printed up, and actually Brian was great about making sure they got into
all the throughways,
the travel areas on the thruway.
Right.
And we were actually distributing about 3,000 of those a week at one point, and we blew through them fast. And the result that we saw was that the volume of visitors that we had tripled.
Yeah.
Now, anytime you can triple your business, that's pretty darn good. So we were excited about that. Now, the program unfortunately didn't get funded for this coming year. In fact, they had a meeting yesterday that I missed, but they're working on trying to get some money together to reprint those brochures. But that's when we decided maybe we ought to jump in ourselves, and we formed the Mohawk Country Group. We are getting some money through I Love New York to print brochures up, our own brochures that we'll get out. We're setting up a website.
I was going to ask you about that.
And then we're getting some assistance. We've applied to Montgomery County for tourism money to help us with some events that we're going to do in July, this coming July. Because July being the high tourist month, there's like 10 times the number of tourists on the thruway then.
Right.
So we're really targeting those people to get them off the thruway, come and visit these sites, and while you're there, spend some money with us.
So it sounds to me like marketing the history or heritage of Montgomery County, not just Montgomery County, but the Mohawk Valley, that would really pays off, and that maybe I'm not trying to get political here, but maybe we need to spend a little bit more in that direction.
But you're hitting it right. If you so many times I hear people say, this is a great old place and we've got to save it. Well, that's not a plan. That's just trying to get everybody to feel sorry for an old building.
Right.
And you'll get lots of sympathy, but you'll never get any money.
Right.
But if you can show that you're a catalyst for economic development,
yes,
that you're going to make that history pay for itself. My favorite saying, Brian's heard me say it 100 times here, is that your industry can pack up and move away, but your history is here forever.
It's here forever. And this is something I've been preaching for years and years and years. In fact, in this book I wrote, most of this book are essays that appeared in various newspapers, and one of them was about the two most important things in the Mohawk Valley that are here are its beauty and its history. And at the time, I felt we're kind of ruining both of them. We're not paying enough attention to them. And like you said, Super Steel came to Schenectady, stayed a few years, went. We've seen that. Coleco came here, had great jobs for many, many, many years, but then they packed up and left. But the Revolutionary War was here, and it will always be. The Iroquois history, the Dutch history, all of that.
Yes.
Will always be here, and it's attractive to other people, but sometimes I feel, and now I'm preaching here, but sometimes I feel like those of us who live here, have been here a long time, we don't appreciate it. We're like the people who've lived at Falls all their lives, and they don't even pay attention to it anymore.
And it's too bad. Some of the nicest sites are run by the state of New York. There's also several sites that are national park sites, but they really don't do anything to promote those sites. I mean, it's just not permitted. What about like the
Herkimer House? Is that promoted much?
No, they're not promoted. It's not. There's no money budgeted for that. They just simply aren't allowed to do it. Right. I mean, I Love New York does promotion, but it's more general kinds of things. They'll promote New York City, they'll promote the Adirondacks, but they really don't get into any kinds of specifics. And the result, of course, is it's out of sight is out of mind, and people just lose interest. And then what you end up finding out is, come budget crunch time, who's at the top of the closure list? The General Herkimer Home, Johnson Hall, Schoharie Crossing. They're always at the top of the closure list. So we're hoping to change that. I mean, we want to work with these sites too.
Well, I think what you're doing is a great thing, and I mean, it's a big undertaking, but eventually if it could spread out and you could get this whole Revolutionary War area connected together, and with money being spent to draw tourists in, But sometimes I don't know if the people are sold, we're sold on the idea.
Yeah.
And we've studied it enough to know that it works, but I'm not sure that the people in power here necessarily are, and we have to sell it to them, maybe.
The Path Through History project helped a lot. It was not perfect by any means, but it got a lot of us all talking to each other at the different historic sites, and everybody realizes the depth of the problem, and they like the idea of working together. So, if nothing else, it's got us all working together. People over in Johnstown, this Mohawk country thing, I've talked to people over there, and we're already talking about how we would expand it the following year to encompass.
Bring in Fulton County and.
Like exit 28 at Fultonville, we could have people, we could have brochures and pull people off the thruway and stop at History and Archives and Fonda and head up to Johnstown, which Johnstown has some just beautiful sites up there. Really
the courthouse,
the drum house.
Drum house.
The tavern.
I finally got to go in the drum house last year. It's another place I put off going to.
Yeah, I did too.
Beautiful.
Nice exhibits in there too.
Very nice.
As usual, we're running out of time, but we still got a lot of material to cover.
That's a good thing.
Brian,
Yes.
what got you interested in local history?
Actually, believe it or not, I didn't get a Regents diploma because I failed the U.S. history
Did you
test.
really?
So, kind of make that ironic, but I just was, driving when I was I went back to school later in life, and as I was driving by like Fort Johnson, I was kind of piqued interest in it, and I stopped there one day, did a tour, and next thing you know, I was volunteering, and I actually had to do some volunteer work for school, so then I'm like, well, I'll volunteer there. So I volunteered at Fort Johnson for a while, then my wife lived across the street from Norm, so then I got to know Norm, and he pulled me onto the board with Fort Plain, and I kind of always was interested in it, but going on vacation, like down to Virginia, also got me into it as well, like going to Williamsburg and Mount Vernon and stuff like that, which, I drag my wife to these places, and, so she's a saint.
Well, she probably drags you to some places, right?
Yeah.
It works both ways. Norm, do you have, well, I should ask both of you, do either one of you have a background in history, or is it just more?
I had thought about going to school and majoring in history, and my son did, but I couldn't figure out how I was going to make any money with it.
Yeah.
That's always the problem.
Yes, it's like my degree in English. If you don't teach, then it's tough to make a living with certain degrees.
But because I was always interested in these historic attractions and that type of business, I ended up going to school for hotel and restaurant management.
Oh,
so
well, that's not totally removed from what you're trying to do.
It's not. Of course, over the years and in a career, you ended up working in the food business, and I was in the restaurant business and so on. So I was doing that type of thing. But now, as my kids are growing and gone, getting into your retirement years. So I've been able to get back into things with the Fort Plain Museum. And as I mentioned earlier, I grew up with the place. I was there from day one when they were digging on the hilltop, and my family was always involved with the place, and we had a lot of history lovers in our family, so I had the indoctrination.
We'll get time for a couple more questions. One thing that struck me in reading about the Mohawk Valley during the Revolution was the devastation. This winter's been a brutal winter. When you read Drums Along the Mohawk, you sense how brutal those winters were, without a thermostat to turn up, and with the attacks by Tories and British and their allies and so on. So what happened to the Mohawk Valley? What was it like at the end of the Revolution?
Well, it really was depopulated. Over 2/3 of the people were gone, and they do describe, Marinus Willett, in a letter to General Washington, describes right at the end of the war, with peace being declared, that the roads were just jammed with people all coming back to reclaim their property and get reestablished. But it was pretty much a ghost town up here, though, as the war wore on.
And the vast majority of them had to rebuild their houses and so on.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Because they were, I forget, 2/3 of the houses were burned down in the area, or something like that. I can't
absolutely.
remember.
Yeah, you're hard pressed to find. I mean, we have very nice examples of German Palatine homes that have survived because they were lucky enough that the raids went around them, and even though some of them didn't make it into the 20th century.
Well, I've been trying to figure out why my house was spared, because my house was pre-revolutionary post and beam structure
Yeah.
on Yankee Hill. It's the one allegedly that Clarissa Putman lived in for about a decade before she moved to Schenectady. And I can't
Maybe that-
come up with a good reason why.
I'll tell you, they all, it was very much a localized thing and very personal thing with people being arrested and their homes being burned. And so when they went from farm to farm, they often knew if those people were rebels or loyalists. They had a
Well,
hit list of people they were after.
Here's the thing, the property was owned by the Johnson family,
Right.
or one of their relatives, whatever. But Clarissa Putman was living in it, and she was a patriot,
Right.
you know, she was American. So, I don't know, maybe the combination of the two protected,
And
it's
it
all
would be,
guess.
it
It's
would,
all
right,
guess.
that's right.
Yeah.
Without really investigating, it would be hard to come up with a solid explanation for it. But, you know, it survived, and that was the great thing.
Yeah.
You know, the Fry home, which is a privately owned home in Canajoharie, Fort Fry, that dates back to 1750, and that's still there. It's right next to the river.
Right.
Of course, Fort Clock,
Yeah.
a little further
I love
out.
Fort Clock.
Beautiful Palatine home. that
Fort Clark,
survived.
it was Jacob Clark, and I think his son was a loyalist, and he was, head of the Tryon County Militia.
So, you know,
So
that's
they-
another point I wanted to cover
Yeah.
quickly. You know, you get right down to it, the American Revolution was our first Civil War.
Yes.
In many ways.
Yeah.
We got less than 2 minutes, so quickly tell me when the museum is open and the hours, and then briefly review the days and time for your conference.
We're going to open, May 1st this year, we're planning on.
Yeah, we're going to
opening.
open May 1st, the first night of the conference. We'll be open Monday through Sunday, 10 to 4, so 7 days a week.
7 days a week, 10 to 4, we do.
We do that right up until Labor Day, and then at Labor Day, we go to like Fridays and weekends up until like almost the end of
Last
October.
year, we did a fall schedule for the first time, worked out very
Yeah.
well, so
Oh, good.
we'll probably do an abbreviated schedule this fall.
And we may expand on it too, depending on how well it goes.
And the days and time for your first annual Revolutionary War Conference are?
Yes, it starts Friday, May 1st at 4 p.m. That's early registration with a cocktail reception at 6 p.m. And then at 9 a.m. the next morning at the Arkell Museum at the hall there, we're having the conference with the 6 authors. That will start at 9 and go throughout the day. And then on Sunday at the Fort Plain Museum, May 3rd, will be the bus tour of Mohawk Country, and that will start at 9 a.m.
Okay, and if you need more information, you can contact Brian Mack at 774-5669. That's 774-5669. Or you can email fortplainmuseum@yahoo.com. That's fortplainmuseum@yahoo.com. And I want to thank Brian and Norm for being here today on Valley Vox. This is Dan Weaver, your host of Valley Vox. This is WCSS 1490 AM, and I look forward to joining you again next week with Robert Von Haslin.
1490 AM, WCSS Amsterdam, Cranesville Radio Network's flagship station. I'm J.C. Hayes, and it's time for Beatles Weekly.
Ladies and gentlemen, honored by their country, decorated by their queen, and loved here in America, here are the Beatles!
I'm Ringo and I play the drums.
Well, I'm Paul and I play the bass. I'm George and I play a guitar. I'm John and I too play guitar.
And here they are, the Beatles! Welcome,
Hello, Beatlemaniacs. Here we go again, another edition of Beatles Weekly with me, J.C. Hayes. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to the show this and every weekend here on your radio or on your interwebs. Got a great show for you today as we go back into the studio, as the boys did this week in 1967 as they were recording tracks for Sgt. Pepper. We'll play some of those for you. Plus, John and Harry Nilsson got into trouble in 1974. We'll talk about that. Right now, since we're still in the dead of winter, I think it's time to check in with the doctor right here on Beatles Weekly.
Bring my friend